where he also studied soil and ecosystem ecology. He's led biological research for over a decade out at the Archbold Biological Station in Lake Placid, Florida. And just recently, he actually presented at the Florida Native Plant Society Conference in 2016 on the importance of native plants for urban diversity. So his message definitely encompasses our common mission that us as native plant lovers in Florida like. So please welcome Dr. Patrick Bohlen.
This is the correct way.
I believe.
Where am I going in? How am I speaking? This thing?
Yeah,
Good.
just use it and you'll be fine.
All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a true pleasure to be here. Somebody said, I don't know, Dr. Bohlen, it's an honor to have you here. Well, it's an honor for me to be here. It's an honor for me to be here.
Thank you.
Because you are all part of the Florida Native Plant Society. I think we have multiple chapters here, which is a rare and unusual thing in and of itself. And Florida has the best Native Plant Society in the world. Right? So I think it's fantastic. It is an honor to be here. It's really a great group, the Florida Native Plant Society, and I think we should all remind ourselves how lucky we are to have one another in these groups that we have in the state. Now, I always hesitate to get up and talk to a group like this about native things because you all know more than I do about native plants and probably a lot of other things. But I do have some perspective I'm hoping I'm going to bring you today. Now this is, I think my talk said yards. I'm not going to talk about yards. Yards are one part of an urban landscape that I will discuss, and I stole this picture off the Facebook advertising my event. I don't know whose thing this is, but it is a beautiful yard. And so if you thought you were coming tonight and maybe Dr. Bohlen was going to talk about how to make a biodiverse yard and kind of a how-to thing on how to do that, yes? Oh, they want to see my jump up on the stage?
Yeah!
Yeah! Like Tom Petty up here. Oh. That's tough. That's hard. That's hard.
Don't do it like that.
Okay, so those of you in the back can see if I jump down, I'll be like a Bruce Springsteen move then. So, at any rate, this is not a how-to on how to make a beautiful Florida biodiverse native yard. My yard is mostly St. Augustine, mostly very weedy and unwatered, and I don't have a lot. I have a few native plants in my yard. I spend a lot of my day working on this kind of stuff. So the last thing I do when I get home, the last thing I want to do is work in the yard. So anyway, I'm not here to talk about how to create a beautiful biodiverse yard. I do want to give you a perspective on the phenomenon of urbanization and what it means for biodiversity and how we can start thinking about getting biodiversity back into, preserve what's there and get it back into our urban landscapes. And I'm sure most of the people in this room already have a lot of ideas about that. You've probably read books about that. You probably know a lot about that. So if you walk out of here today, you learned one thing, I will be happy because you're a tough group, you know a lot. But hopefully I give you some perspective, put it in a broader context, and talk about the very important subject of biodiversity and urbanization. Florida is a very urban state. The world is becoming more urban. It's about 50% urban right now. The first time in history in the past 10 years or so, we switched over to more people living in urban areas than rural areas. And it's about 4% of the globe. So when we talk about urbanization, people say, well, it's still only about 4% of the terrestrial world. Well, in Florida, it's about 30%, or it's heading that way. So for a place like Florida, where we have a place where a lot of people want to live, we have a lot of water, we have a lot of capability to support population, actually urban areas occupy a big part of the landscape. And the other thing about Florida, and this is showing today, and everyone I'm sure is familiar with the Florida 1,000 Friends of Florida diagram I'm showing here, is that it's growing. It's growing. Now there are different projections. This is one projection that if county plans were supported and it grew like we think it's going to grow. And of course, the Friends of 1,000 like to give different scenarios. They give different scenarios. This is like business as usual. which in Florida is a lot of what we tend to do, is have growth business as usual. But there are different scenarios, and the scenarios that play out are going to have everything to do with the decisions people make in the state, whether it's a legislator or a local community or a city, what we decide to do and how we develop. But the main thing I want to point out is, no matter what, 30% of Florida is urban. And urban's a lot of different things. It's suburban, it's exurban, it's urban. Development's big in Florida, it's going to be big. And so when we talk about biodiversity, we really have to think about the impact of this urbanization on that. And it's a global phenomenon, obviously, but Florida, we're faced with a lot of it. And really, as part of the Florida, is the eastern coastal plain, the North American coastal plain, development and disturbance has a long history here, which began with agriculture. Most of this region, the coastal plain, was longleaf pine ecosystem, of which there is very little left. So we talk about native plants and native communities and our favorite little native place we go. This whole coastal plain was longleaf forest, and it is gone. So what's left is already not what was there. And it's a very disturbed place. Obviously, North Florida has some wonderful undisturbed areas, Apalachicola and things like that. But we live in an area, in a region that has a lot of disturbance and development, which isn't that unusual for 2017. And I know people in this room know what biodiversity is and why we should care about it, so I could just skip this whole slide. But it does raise the question people want to know. And a lot of people put a lot of different reasons for that, whether it's utilitarian, we need biodiversity so we can extract drugs from plants, we need biodiversity because we never know what we're going to need, we need biodiversity because it helps process all of our waste and clean our environment, we need biodiversity because it's a signal that everything's okay with the environment. But there are a lot of different reasons. One of the people who's probably spoken most eloquently about this and given the perspective and really kind of made biodiversity a prominent idea among the general public was E.O. Wilson, who's still with us, but he is retired and getting quite elderly now. He wrote The Diversity of Life and The Naturalist, and really not only explained what biodiversity is to the general public, not just to his biological colleagues, but he also explained its importance to us, where it comes from, why we have it, and why we need it. And of course, he's argued most recently that we need to preserve 50% of the surface of the earth if we're really going to have the conservation that we need. And whether that happens or not, I don't know. If we go back and look at Florida, we're not in such bad shape. We're all appalled by that urbanization diagram. Done a pretty darn good job in the state of Florida preserving land. I know there's arguments about the amendment and the legislature won't spend the money. We got about 30% of the land locked up in natural area. You know, whether it's being managed properly or not, one could argue. We're lucky. Go to Illinois. Go to Illinois. Chicago, corn, and soybean. That's all you're going to find there. So we're very lucky in Florida. We're already at 30%. We're doing pretty good here. So E.O. Wilson is really, and like, you know, he had a bug period when he was a kid. And so did I, although I didn't collect bugs, but we are both entomologists, which is, entomologists seem to have a lot to say about biodiversity, which we'll talk about in a minute, why that's the case. So a couple years ago, I've got to get my water. A couple years ago, Reed Noss who's one of our great conservation biologists here, just retired from UCF, sorry to lose him, announced there's these biodiversity hotspots around the world. They announced that the coastal plain of North America is one of the 38 biological hotspots globally, meaning that it's an area with a lot of biodiversity that has global significance. And you'll remember the other diagram I just showed you about 85% of this area being highly disturbed. One of our iconic upland creatures is obviously the gopher tortoise, for obvious reasons. It is a key member of the community in our upland systems, and because of its role in digging burrows, we know that there are hundreds of other organisms that at one time in their life benefit from those burrows. If we have a scrub, mixed scrub, upland, flatwood systems without gopher tortoises, it's really not that system, because you need the tortoises. However, to have it in an urban area, you've got to have a mead gardens or a UCF arboretum. You've got to have a big place. You might have it in your backyard. If you live in Audubon Park, probably not, because they need space. They need territory. And so if you look at, we're not going to go through, ignore the numbers on this table. It's just to show you from that work that Reed Noss did, have a lot of species in the coastal plain. These are, of course, all the vertebrates. And a lot of them are endemic. Endemic means they're native to the area. Now, this diagram and table includes a lot of subspecies because we have a lot of things like the Florida panther. It's a puma. It's what it is. It's a broad species, but we have the subspecies. We have the black bear. We consider it a subspecies. But be that as it may, you can look at whether you're looking at full species or the subspecies. We do have a lot of endemism, meaning those species are found here and nowhere else. Tremendous amount of diversity in the coastal plain. Tremendous amount of diversity. And a lot of that has to do with the diversity of the habitats and plant communities, obviously. But that's not where the diversity is. And you all know that, I'm sure, as well. It's not in that, what entomologists like to call that Noah's Ark ecology, the two of every kind. Most of the organisms on Earth are insects. Insects. And we see that they far outnumber all other organisms on the planet. And that is, makes them a really good subject matter for biodiversity. It means we need to think about the role that they have. Many of us know with plants, there's that interaction plants have with insects. And we really have to consider those species as well. And unlike the gopher tortoise, there's a lot of these little guys we can actually have in our yards, in our urban ecosystems. Most of them are beetles. The Hymenoptera, which are the bees, wasps, and ants. The flies, a lot of flies out there. And the butterflies and moths make up the most of the insects. So these groups, and one of the things that makes these groups stand out, for the most part, mosquitoes suck our blood. Most insects in these groups are associated or have a very important association at some point in their life with plants. And their evolution, the creation of this great diversity, was totally dependent on the emergence of the flowering plants 250 million years ago. That's when we had the great speciation among plants, and the insects followed. So I want to get back to urbanization. We saw the urbanization. We've had a little bit of a discussion here about biodiversity. What drives urban biodiversity? I did give a talk a couple of years ago at the Native Plant Society meeting. If you were there, sorry, there's going to be some repeat slides. Just wait. But urbanization is a big phenomenon globally now. In a place like Florida, there's a lot of it going on. Obviously, we introduced a lot of species. We changed the structure of the environment dramatically. We changed the structure of patches, remaining habitat patches, and a patch is like an area of natural area or green space, how they're arranged in space. We have urban soils, which are not like native soils. You can put all these in your yard. They won't necessarily be adapted if you've got real urban soils. Impervious surfaces are obviously a big deal. We also have functional changes. The flow of water is changed due to the impervious surface, the heat island effect of the absorbing surfaces, the loss of natural drivers, which here would be like fire. We don't have fire like we should. All of these things then join together to affect the distribution of the species, the diversity and distribution of these organisms. Now, this kind of development is obviously very common. This is a typical suburban. Can anybody tell me where this is?
Suburbia.
Suburbia, Claremont. How many roofs? How many neighborhoods do you know? How many neighborhoods do you know that have red and blue roofs on them? It's got to be somewhere else. It's got to be somewhere else. How about Beijing, China? How about Beijing, China? They live just like us, and they build just like us, and they have HOAs just like we do that are built by the same corporations that built the one you may or may not live in, depending on where you live. So we have this kind of development. A lot of work has been done. Oh, I lost my graph, which is not good. The graph disappeared. It didn't show. Look at that. So we'll just talk you through it. It had a distribution of plants in urban core, suburban, and exurban areas. And what it showed is, as you went out to your exurban, you had more native species. But alien species, introduced horticultural varieties, were pretty similar across the whole urban gradient. And you had a very similar total number of plant species in the exurban and urban core. Didn't lose that much diversity, because we add a lot of diversity, because we plant a lot of plants from all over the world. and it increases the plant diversity. This one we can see, thank God. And it shows the review of species this is from 105 publications, like summarizing results. And what you can see here is they're looking at plants, vertebrates, and invertebrates, species richness, which is the number of species in those groups, along a gradient of intensity of urbanization. 1 being the lowest, 3 being the highest. Dramatic differences and interesting patterns. Whether they're generalizable or not is hard to say. One thing we see is that plants actually greatly peak in diversity in some of these, in this summarized studies. In the intermediate urbanization, because we're bringing in so much darn plant material in most of our urban areas from other parts of the world, we increase the diversity. Insects, interestingly, just go down. They just go down the more intense urbanization gets. But I just told you that's where all the biodiversity is. And you've got the plants, so where are the invertebrates? Where are the invertebrates?
Spray.
If we look at another recent study of insect species in Melbourne, and this is looking just within the city, this was kind of interesting because they looked at different habitats. This is a pretty recent study. And they found that total species richness of insects was greatest in these mid-story. Like if you plant some firebush, if you plant some of these other species here, you're creating kind of a mid-story shrub kind of habitat. Supports the greatest amount of diversity in this case. Grassland, and this is native grassland, not lawns. A kind of prairie type system, supports a good number. And trees, just in and of themselves, are very supportive of insect life. And then you have the lawn. The lawn. Not a great. The thing is, in most urban areas, the lawn makes up a lot of what's out there. A lot of what's out there. So you can see right away in urban systems that drive this way, you would get rid of invertebrates that way. Another thing I just want to point out quickly is that not all species are harmed by, depends on an interaction, by urbanization. Here is a lorikeet, which looks like it's a pretty cool bird. I wish we had those in Florida. They actually do better in the streets and the remnants. They benefit from the altered habitats. You're bound to find a species among species that benefits from an altered habitat. I don't think this is a good example, though, for us for like the general case. The general case. But it does happen. Some species are going to benefit from changes. This is a very complex diagram. I just want to point out it's a paper that really talked about types of urban development going back 2,000 years and the patterns and trajectories of native species in those environments. And they describe these 3 main types. It's kind of a conceptual paper. But one of the things they pointed out or said is that ultimately everybody's headed here, where the proportion of native vegetation in an urban area, even with these different trajectories and timings and when it happened, you get to the same low point, which is kind of discouraging based on the urbanization I just showed you in Florida. Now, one of their exceptions in this study was Los Angeles, which actually had more diversity than they expected to see. And I think in America we might be lucky because we're developing our cities at a time when we do have an environmental ethic. We do have people that are concerned about conservation. We're developing our cities at the same time that we're more interested in these things. So I don't think this is inevitable. And I think where you end up on this trajectory depends on how you manage that growth and what you make important to you as you develop urban areas. So given that we have this push to maybe reduce biodiversity in urban ecosystems by the very nature of them, what can we do to bring it back? And I'm sure most of you are familiar with Doug Tallamy's work. We'll get to that in a minute. One of the things I want to talk about first, though, is the importance of scale. And when we talk about biodiversity in urban systems, I've heard people talk about the natural areas you're going to go to. We've talked about our yards. So you've really got natural areas in urban areas, and we have some true wilderness in some of our urban parks or urban natural areas that are by the side of the road that you pass in your car, that if you walked in, you know, you'd be in the middle of a wilderness. We have landscapes, and they're really more abundant than gardens. And gardens are more intensive, and so we have this kind of gradient of intensity of management, and we have different kinds of things to consider when we're talking about biodiversity at these 3 different scales. At the landscape scale, and here's UCF, we have the importance of Wild patches, the patch structure I talked about, where the natural systems are, how they're distributed in space, how they're connected. And UCF is on the edge of the suburbs. So there's a lot of green space. And you have natural lands and farms out here and just wild areas. So we're a more suburban kind of environment. We have a lot of connectivity, the big econ and the little econ river. We have bears on campus because of this. So that's an urban ecosystem. We're suburban, but we would count that as urban. And you can see how this connectivity is very important. If we come to a place like Harry P. Lou Gardens, which is a beautiful, gorgeous natural area right here on the lake, you see just this very high density. We've got some green spaces we get further over towards the econs, UCFs over here, but now you're getting to the urban core. Totally different situation. You don't have the corridors. You aren't going to have bears walking around the neighborhoods over here. Are you? Who lives here? Any bears? Coyote, they get everywhere. Coyotes get everywhere. But you see a lot of green in here. A lot of green. And it's all what we constructed. It's all spaces we constructed around our buildings and our homes, and it's what's left for any kind of wild or natural